The cargo hold smelled like burnt coolant and old regret, and the manifest on my screen showed 17 line items that did not match the 17 crates sitting in Bay 4. One of them was missing. One of them was always missing on runs out of the outer belt, because the loading crews at Carver Station drank on the job and nobody in outer belt logistics had the nerve to say so out loud. I was on my knees behind crate 9, running my hand along the underside of the bay floor panel when the docking horn for Helix Station Orun went off above my head like the station itself was deeply unimpressed with my arrival. Orun was not the kind of place a cargo hand from a nowhere colony got assigned to very often. The station sat in neutral space between 3 major interstellar powers, which meant it was perpetually full of diplomats, security details, translators, and very expensive furniture. It also meant the docking protocols were 17 pages long and required my thumbprint in 6 places before I was allowed to breathe its recycled air. My name is Kale. That is the entire biography relevant to this story. I found the missing crate wedged behind a coolant housing unit in the starboard corridor. Someone had moved it to make room for a personal cooler full of what I strongly suspected was not regulation crew hydration. I logged it, moved it back, did not write up the cooler, because I had been on enough ships to know that the crew who packed your food on long runs deserved one small private happiness, and I was not going to be the man who took that from them. Helix Station Orun docked us in Bay 11, which was the second farthest bay from the central hub, and was typically assigned to vessels that the station considered low diplomatic priority. That was fine. I had no diplomatic priority. I had a manifest, a repair kit, and a stripped bolt on Sublevel 9's conduit relay that I had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The station corridors were wider than I was used to. Everything about Orun was built wide, because it had to accommodate species whose body architecture did not agree with human corridor dimensions. The Veloci, for instance, were tall in a way that made me feel like a footnote. The Kreth-Sa moved sideways when they walked, their 4 limbs working in a horizontal pattern that required at least 3 meters of clear space. I had learned, after 2 years of multi-species runs, to walk close to the walls. I was reading my manifest tablet and walking close to the wall on my way to Sublevel 9 when the Veloci Honor Guard arrived. They did not arrive quietly. Nothing about a Veloci diplomatic escort arrived quietly. The docking bay doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and the sound that came through first was the rhythm of ceremonial boots on station flooring, a sound like a very organized argument. Then came the banners. The Veloci used physical banners in diplomatic spaces, which I had always found interesting, because they were a species with advanced holographic technology, and they chose cloth. The banners were deep blue and gold, and they were attached to actual poles carried by actual soldiers, which meant 14 people had traveled across 4 star systems holding sticks. Behind them came the guard formation, and behind the guard formation came the reason for all of it. I had not been told the princess of the Veloci Concordat was arriving at Orun on the same rotation as my ship. It was not the kind of information that filtered down to cargo crew. I knew what she was because the docking bay stencil on the wall beside me identified her delegation's berth, and because the Veloci flag pattern on the banners matched the one in the multi-species protocol guide I had read on the transit in, out of nothing more than boredom and curiosity. Her name was Sarah. The guide had a full page on her. I had read it the way I read everything, steadily, without urgency, filing it away somewhere behind my eyes. I kept reading my manifest. The honor guard moved into the corridor. I moved closer to the wall. The lead guard, a Veloci soldier whose exoskeleton plating put him at roughly 7 feet and whose posture put him at roughly the temperature of a small star, noticed me when he was 4 feet away. He stopped. The entire procession stopped. His hand moved to his side, where the shock blade was holstered. Not a draw. The beginning of the thought of a draw. I looked up from the tablet. He was looking at me the way a man looks at an insect he has not yet decided to move around or remove. His second eyelids, the translucent ones Veloci used for threat assessment, slid halfway across. I had read about those in the guide, too. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. I looked at the manifest, looked at the corridor geometry, looked at him, There was a reasonable path around the cargo stack to my left that would give the procession full clearance through the main channel. I stepped to the left. I said, "The lane's clear now." Then I went back to the manifest. The second eyelids, from what I could see in my peripheral vision, did not finish the threat assessment slide. The guard moved his hand back to a neutral position. The procession began to move again. She passed close enough that I could see the quality of her diplomatic robe, which was the kind of quality that did not have a price because pricing it would have been embarrassing for everyone involved. She was looking at me the way I imagined she looked at everything, with the calm, organized attention of someone cataloging the world as they moved through it. I was on line 14 of my manifest. 17 crates, one previously missing, now located. Net variance from logged weight, 3 kilograms, which was within acceptable range for the outer belt loading crews and their informal storage habits. She kept walking. I kept reading. The procession rounded the far corridor bend, and the sound of ceremonial boots faded, and Helix Station Orun went back to its regular noise. I did not watch her go. There was nothing to watch. She was heading to her suite, and I was heading to Sub-Level 9, and the two destinations had nothing to do with each other. I had a relay to fix, and a bolt that had been stripped to a smooth cylinder, and a butter knife I was going to use as a makeshift driver, because the proper driver was at the bottom of my kit bag under 4 days of gear. The station corridors smelled like recycled air, and something floral that the Veloci delegation had probably introduced, because Veloci brought their own atmospheric additive to diplomatic postings. I had read that too. I read a lot. Nobody ever expected me to, which was, in my experience, a more useful asset than most things you could put on a credentials form. Sub-Level 9 was where the station kept its infrastructure: conduit housing, relay banks, atmospheric processors, the kind of systems that made a station function and that nobody in a diplomatic suite ever had cause to think about. The maintenance corridors down there were narrow by Orun standards, which made them wide by the standards of anywhere I had ever worked. There were no banners, there was no ceremonial boot sound, there was a relay panel that needed attention, a stripped bolt, and me. I settled in. The butter knife was going to be fine. Somewhere above me, 14 soldiers were arranging themselves around a woman who moved through the galaxy with the certainty of someone who had never once had to improvise a screwdriver. I did not have an opinion about that. It just was what it was, the way everything was what it was, and you either adapted or you stood in the corridor waiting for the geometry to rearrange itself around you. The geometry never rearranged itself. You moved to the left. You got on with it. 3 days later, I would be in a room with her, and she would ask me a question that seemed to her like a simple question, and my answer would rearrange something in her taxonomy that had been set since her education began. But that was 3 days away. Right now I had a relay to fix. The alarm went off at 14:22 station time, while I was on my second attempt at the stripped bolt with the butter knife and a piece of cloth wound around the handle for grip. The sound filled Sub-Level 9, like something between a dying musical instrument and a very loud suggestion that I reconsider my current location. It was the containment breach alarm. I had heard it before, on a wildlife survey station in the outer reaches, when a pair of Drell cats had gotten into the main habitat and the station crew had evacuated in under 4 minutes while I had been in the crawl space above the feed room, finishing a maintenance log. The sound was the same. The implication was the same. I looked at the bolt. I looked at the corridor. The alarm continued to express its feelings about the situation. I went back to the bolt. Above me, in the main hub of Helix Station Orun, every species with an evacuation protocol was executing it. The Veloci Guard moved into diamond formation and sealed Princess Sarah into the protected interior of their arrangement, moving at a pace that was not running but was faster than walking by a meaningful margin. The Krethsa delegation sealed their atmospheric suits in the smooth, practiced motion of people who had run this drill so many times it had stopped feeling like urgency and started feeling like memory. The Halen cluster moved to their designated pressure corridors and sealed the blast doors behind them. Every species had a protocol. I had a butter knife and a stripped bolt, and 6 hours until my ship departed. The maintenance logs on Sublevel 9 had not been updated in 11 days, which was relevant because the relay I was working on was part of the atmospheric cycling system for the lower cargo bays, and if it failed completely, the bay seals would drop to backup power and the temperature would drop 12 degrees. Not dangerous. Inconvenient. Enough to compromise 3 of my crates if I left it until after departure. I was not going to leave it. The alarm shifted pitch. That meant the breach had been located and classified. On a station like Orun, classification meant the security system had identified the breach agent and flagged its threat level. A pitch shift to the lower tone meant the flagging had landed somewhere above standard containment. I finished with the bolt. It moved. Not clean. The thread was stripped down to almost nothing, but it caught enough to hold the housing plate in place, which was all it needed to do until Orun's own maintenance crew got to it properly. I picked up my kit and thought about what had a containment breach alarm on a diplomatic station in neutral space, and a threat flag that shifted the tone. The answer came through the station's secondary announcement system, which played in maintenance corridors because the original designers had understood that the people most likely to be in maintenance corridors during emergencies were the ones who most needed to know what the emergency was. Greth, 2 of them. Sublevel 9, Section 4. I put the kit down. Greth were from the Veldara Rift colonies. I had never seen one in person, but I had read everything there was to read on a 3-week transit through empty space, and the profile on Greth took up considerable space in the multi-species threat assessment document that most cargo crews kept for emergencies and never actually read. I had read mine twice. They were large. They were fast in enclosed spaces. They were ambush predators, which meant their entire neurological response system was tuned to a single input: movement. Specifically, the kind of movement that prey made. Section 4 of Sublevel 9 was 2 maintenance corridors and 1 relay junction away from where I was standing. I picked the kit back up. I thought about the path back to the main hub. I thought about what was between me and it. I thought about ambush predators and the input they responded to. Then I walked toward Section 4. Not because I was unaware of what I was walking toward. I was completely aware. I had read the threat document twice. I knew the Greth's visual range, their reaction time, their preferred conditions for engagement. I knew that standard protocol for non-military personnel encountering Greth in an enclosed space was to seal the nearest blast door and wait for armed response. I knew all of that. But the relay junction between me and Section 4 was the main branch point for Sublevel 9's atmospheric cycling. If the Greth had damaged any of the housing panels in that section, and large agitated animals in enclosed spaces tended to damage things simply by existing, then the repair I had just done would fail within the hour, because it was downstream of whatever was happening in Section 4, and I had 6 hours until departure. I moved through the first corridor, slow, no rushing, no sharp sound. The kit bag I held against my side, so nothing in it swung free and clattered. The maintenance lighting in Sublevel 9 was amber, which was not ideal for seeing things clearly, but was good for not presenting as a high-contrast target. The second corridor opened into the relay junction, and the relay junction was where I found them. 2 Greth. The document had described them accurately, which I noted with the part of my brain that always noticed whether documentation was accurate. They were the size of something that did not belong in an enclosed space. Their surface texture registered in ambient light, the way water registered. Reflective, shifting, not quite one color. They were facing the far wall of the junction, which meant they had their backs to the corridor entrance where I had stopped. I stood very still. They were not moving. One of them had its head down near a conduit housing panel that had been bent outward from the wall. The panel was not supposed to be bent outward. Something had made contact with it, and the something had been the Greth. I looked at the panel. I looked at the atmospheric relay junction behind it. The junction was intact. The conduit housing was damaged but not breached. The relay I had fixed upstream was, for now, functional. The Greth shifted. The one nearest the panel turned slightly, and one of its sensory clusters, The document had called them lateral arrays, positioned mid-body, oriented in my general direction. I did not move. It kept orienting. And then, because I had read the document twice, and the document had been very specific about what ambush predators keyed their escalation responses to, I did the thing that the document said non-military personnel never did in proximity to Greth. I spoke. Not loudly, not at high pitch, not with the kind of urgency that would read as distress signal in any predator's language. I spoke the way I spoke to everyone, the way I had spoken to my first captain on my first run, who had expected me to be afraid of her, and to the loading crews at Carver Station, who expected me to be frustrated, and to the Veloci Honor Guard, who had expected me to back against the wall and wait. Low, steady, like a man working through a logistics problem out loud. "Junction's intact," I said. "You haven't hit anything critical yet." The Greth did not lunge. The document had said they would lunge or they would freeze, and lunging was triggered by flight response, and freezing was triggered by the absence of recognizable input. I was not running, I was not frozen. I was talking, at a register and pace that did not fit either category in their response library. They had no file for this. The one nearest the panel turned fully toward me. I kept talking. I told them about the relay, about the stripped bolt, about the 3-kilogram variance in my manifest, and why it probably meant the cooler under the bunk in cabin 3. My voice stayed where it was, even, working through it, the sound of a man who had encountered an obstacle and was deciding how to route around it. The Greth nearest me took one step back. Then the second one did. I watched that happen. 3 feet of distance opening between us, then 4, then 5 as they pressed back toward the far wall of the junction. I was still afraid. I want to be clear about that. My hands were completely steady, and my voice was completely steady, and my heart rate was doing something I was going to have words with it about later. But it did not change the geometry of the situation. It did not change the relay junction, or the conduit housing, or the manifest that was waiting on my tablet. The Greth held position at the far wall. I turned, calmly, and walked back through the second corridor and the first corridor and out of sub-level 9. I did not run. I walked. Behind me, I could hear nothing from the junction. The Greth had not followed. The security team would be there within minutes. The relay junction was intact. My repair upstream would hold. I found a wall panel in the corridor outside sub-level 9 and leaned against it for a moment. Just one moment. The alarm was still going. Someone's boots were running down the main hub corridor above me. The station was doing what stations did in emergencies, organizing itself, deploying its hierarchy, sending its ranked and classified responders to the right locations. I checked my manifest. 17 crates. 1 previously missing, now located. Net variance within acceptable range. I started walking back toward Bay 11. 3 floors above me, in the station's security monitoring center, Princess Sarah of the Veloci Concordat was watching a security feed from sub-level 9 on a screen held by one of her aides. She had reviewed the footage once at normal speed. She was watching it again. I did not know that. If I had known it, it would not have changed anything about the relay, or the manifest, or the 6 hours I had until departure. But that is what was happening. She watched my hands. She watched them through the second corridor, through the junction approach, through all of it. They never shook. She told her aide to mark the footage for the security debrief. Her aide asked which crew member's file to attach it to. She thought about the man in the docking bay, with the manifest tablet who had not watched her walk away. "Find out his name," she said. The departure board had Cale Draven on it. She read that name 3 times. She had a system for ranking everything she encountered. She had been trained in it from the age of 7. The system had categories for every species, every class, every psychological profile that the Veloci Concordat had encountered in 400 years of interstellar diplomacy. She pulled up the category for humans. She looked at the footage again. She looked at the category. For the first time in 14 years of using the system, she felt that she might be looking at it wrong. Not wrong in the way that required correction, wrong in the way that required a different pair of eyes entirely. She set the footage to play again. She watched his hands. Still. The security debrief was scheduled for the following morning. She had initiated it herself, through official diplomatic channels, which meant it would arrive on his ship's crew manifest as a formal station request, which meant he was required to attend. She had written the request carefully. She had used the Veloci construction for addressing unranked personnel, a form that was technically correct, procedurally appropriate, and calibrated to put the recipient slightly off balance before the conversation began. It was a tool she had used in 200 diplomatic exchanges. She expected it to work the way it always worked. She was wrong about that. He arrived without the off balance. He arrived, in fact, with a small tray of station-issued protein cubes and the air of a man who had somewhere to be afterward. The room she had chosen for the debrief was designed for the kind of meeting where the station wanted to convey authority without aggression. Good light, clean surfaces, a table that was wide enough to establish professional distance. She sat on the side with the window. He sat on the side with the door and immediately began sorting the protein cubes into a grid. She pretended not to notice. He pretended not to be doing it. She opened with the formal version of her first question, the full diplomatic phrasing, the one that established her authority to ask and his obligation to answer. He answered in one sentence. It was an accurate sentence. It contained exactly the information she had asked for and nothing she had not. She asked a follow-up. He answered that in one sentence too. She recalibrated. Were you unaware of the threat classification of the Greth? She asked. No, he said. She waited. He moved a protein cube from the third row to the fourth. You were aware, she said, not a question. A confirmation, said the way you confirm something that has changed the meaning of the prior 10 minutes. Yes, he said, they're ambush predators, keyed to movement. Standard containment protocol for non-military is blast door seal and wait. You did not do that. No. She looked at the protein cube grid. 4 rows, 4 columns. He was working on the 5th. Why not? He considered this the way you consider whether to explain to someone why you take the left road and not the right one when you have always taken the left road because it is simply the road that leads where you are going. The relay junction was at risk, he said. My repair would have failed. 3 crates of perishable pharmaceutical-grade freight, temperature sensitive to 12 degrees variance, 6 hours to departure. That is the reason you walk toward 2 Greth. That is what was between me and the relay junction. She looked at him for a moment. He put a protein cube in the 5th row. Were you not afraid? He stopped sorting. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has asked you a question that is not a bad question, but is somehow a question about a thing so obvious that the asking of it is the surprise. Sure I was, he said. He put the cube down. What does that have to do with it? Not a question. She heard the absence of the rising tone at the end and understood, with the part of her training that analyzed linguistic structure for meaning, that he was not being dismissive. He genuinely did not see the connection she had assumed was universal, the connection between fear and the shape of behavior, between feeling something and doing the thing that feeling prescribed. She had been trained by people who taught her that Veloci courage was the mastery of fear. She had read xenobiology documents that described Krethsa discipline as the channeling of fear into controlled response. She had studied 11 species relationships with danger, and in every one of them, fear was the variable. The presence of it produced certain behaviors. The suppression of it produced others. The absence of it produced what the documents called apex psychology. He had said he was afraid. He had gone anyway, not because of training, not because of discipline, not because of any system that converted the fear into something else. He had been afraid, and it had simply not changed the geometry of what needed doing. She pushed the protein cube grid across the table toward him. He looked at it. The Veloci Concordat, she said, would like to formally acknowledge your actions in sublevel 9. He looked at the protein cubes. He looked at her. He looked at his tablet, which he had placed face down on the table when he sat down and had not checked since, which she noted because it was the first disciplined thing she had seen him do. "That's kind of you," he said. He looked at the door. She understood that the meeting was over. Not because she had ended it, because he had run the logistics of the conversation and reached the point where the output matched the input and there was nothing left that required his presence. She let him go. She sat with the protein cube grid for a long time after he left. It was a perfect 4x4 square, 16 cubes, arranged in straight lines with equal spacing. She had spoken to him for 22 minutes, and she had not found a single place to put him in her system. She picked up one of the cubes. She set it back down. She pulled his file up on her tablet. Colony born. Carver Station, Outer Belt. No formal credentials beyond standard cargo crew certification. No military training. No interspecies combat classification. No diplomatic history. Under species behavioral category, humans. Under human subcategory, generalist. Unranked. No apex classification. She set the tablet down too. She thought about the second eyelids of her lead honor guard, who had been in 8 combat engagements and had reviewed the threat assessment on Greth 3 times in the past year. She thought about what it meant that those eyelids had not completed the threat assessment slide. She thought about the Greth, backed against the far wall of the relay junction, watching a man walk out of the room. She thought about the protein cube grid. Perfect lines. Equal spacing. A man who made order out of whatever material was in front of him and then walked away from it without looking back. She opened her xenobiology files and searched the category for unclassified behavioral variants. The cursor blinked. She closed the file. She was going to need a different category. She just did not know yet what to put in it. The summit was supposed to be the easy part. Diplomatic summits at Helix Station Orun had a reputation for being well organized, highly controlled, and extremely boring in the specific way that important events were boring when all the real work had been done beforehand. The summit between the Veloci Concordat and the Halen cluster had been in preparation for 9 months. The agenda was set. The seating was assigned. The atmospheric mix in the summit chamber had been adjusted to tolerate 4 different species' respiratory needs simultaneously, which was a feat of engineering that deserved more acknowledgement than it got. I was not attending the summit. I was in Bay 11, doing a final reconciliation of the manifest, because the net variance had shifted from 3 kilograms to 4.5 since the last count, and I needed to know whether I had miscounted the crates or whether someone in the crew had been supplementing the personal cooler situation. The explosion, when it came, was not the kind that destroyed things. It was the kind that made a very loud statement. Shaped charge on the upper ring junction, designed to sever communication rather than structure. I had been close enough to that kind of work before to recognize the acoustic signature, the short, flat sound that said, "This was precision, not rage." Somebody had planned this. The station went to emergency lock 3 seconds later. Emergency lock at Orun meant the blast doors sealed by zone, which meant every zone sealed independently, which meant the summit chamber was now separated from the upper hub, which was now separated from the docking bays, which was now separated from sub-level 9, and my ship was in Bay 11 behind a blast door that would not open until station security cleared the lock. I was in Bay 11. The blast doors between me and my ship were open, because Bay 11 was inside the lock zone on my side. Princess Sarah was not on my side. I knew this because the station's secondary announcement system was still running. Whoever had planned the shaped charge on the upper ring junction had not cut the secondary system, which ran on an independent conduit, and the secondary system was telling me, in the flat tones of an automated alert, that the upper hub lock zone contained 6 unaccounted personnel from the summit delegation. 6 was not a large number on a diplomatic station full of delegations and guards and aides and translators. 6 was, however, a specific number. Someone had counted. Someone had determined which 6 people, under which circumstances, would be worth accounting for. I stood in Bay 11 for exactly the length of time it took me to understand what the automated alert was actually saying. Then I picked up my kit. The maintenance corridors between Bay 11 and the upper hub ran through the station's infrastructure spine, the same infrastructure I had spent 2 days of this posting navigating. They did not appear on the station's official schematics, which were the schematics that whoever had planned the shaped charge had presumably used to plan the blast door seal. They appeared on the maintenance logs. I had read the maintenance logs. I moved through the infrastructure spine at a pace that covered ground without creating the kind of noise that announced itself. The station's secondary announcement system kept talking. I kept moving. The blast doors in the maintenance corridors were on a separate circuit from the zone locks. They could be sealed individually, but the zone lock did not automatically seal them. The original designers had thought about what happened when maintenance crews needed to respond to emergencies in locked zones, and they had built accordingly. I was grateful to the original designers. The upper hub was 3 levels above Bay 11. I came up through a service access panel in a corridor that was off the main summit chamber approach. The corridor was empty. The sound from the main hub was not empty. Voices, movement, the particular quality of organized urgency that security responses produced. And then, 2 figures in Veloci diplomatic dress, one of them taller than the other by a meaningful margin, moving toward the corridor where I was standing, from the direction of the summit chamber access. Sarah. 2 aides. No honor guard. The diamond formation was on the other side of the blast doors in the upper hub, and the blast doors were sealed. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. Her expression moved through 3 things in fast sequence: recognition, assessment, recalibration. The aide on her left made a sound that I interpreted as alarm and was probably correct. I said, "There's a maintenance route to the docking bays." She looked at me. "My honor guard is behind a zone lock on the other side of the hub," I said. "The maintenance routes run on a separate circuit. The blast doors in the infrastructure spine are not zone locked." She looked at the corridor behind her, the summit chamber direction, then back at me. "How do you know this?" she asked. "I read the maintenance logs." One of the aides said something in Veloci that I did not catch. She held up a hand and the aide stopped. She looked at me for a full 3 seconds, which was a long time when the station was in emergency lock and someone had planned the shaped charge and the secondary announcement system was still counting unaccounted personnel. "Lead," she said. I led. The infrastructure spine going down was the same route I had come up, which meant I knew every step, every turn, every panel seam and access junction. I moved, and they followed. The aides stayed close. Sarah stayed directly behind me, which I did not think about until later, when I thought about it and realized she had placed herself in the center of the formation, not because she had been told to, but because that was where the protected element went, and she understood geometry even when her guard was not there to explain it. We were 2 junctions above Bay 11 when the corridor ahead went dark for 3 seconds, and then came back on emergency lighting. That meant someone else was in the maintenance network. I stopped. Sarah stopped. The 2 aides did not make sounds. I gave them credit for that. I looked at the junction ahead, 2 corridors meeting at a right angle. The ambient noise from the left corridor was the specific quality of nothing that was worse than something, because silence in a corridor that should have had system noise meant the systems in that corridor had been recently interrupted. Someone had come through recently and was still ahead of us, or had turned off. I thought about the options. The right corridor was longer, but bypassed the junction. It added 4 minutes. It connected to a lower access route that still reached Bay 11. It did not go through whoever was in the left corridor. I started to move right. The left corridor produced 2 people. Kreth Sa, armed. The specific configuration of their gear was not diplomatic. It was tactical, which meant they were not staff or delegates. They were the shaped charge type. They moved into the junction and blocked it. I did not reach for anything. I had no weapon. My kit bag had a butter knife and a manifest tablet and repair equipment, none of which was useful in the way a weapon was useful. I did the math. Then I stepped in front of Sarah. Not a conscious decision. The geometry required it, and I was in the habit of doing what the geometry required. She was the thing that mattered in this corridor, and there was a threat in front of her, and I was between the two of those things, so I was in front. The Kreth-Sa soldiers raised their weapons. I looked at them. Here is what I can tell you about that moment, and I want to be precise, because I have thought about it since, and I want to be honest about what it was, and what it was not. I was afraid. The same way I had been afraid in Sublevel 9 with the Greth. The full, complete, functional afraid that told me what was at risk and what the outcomes were. My heart was doing something. My hands were doing what they always did, which was nothing, because what they did had never had much to do with what the rest of me was feeling. I was not performing calm. I was not suppressing fear. I was afraid, and I was standing in the corridor, and those two things were simply both true at the same time, and did not conflict with each other, the way it can be both raining and warm, and neither fact cancels the other. I held the Kreth-Sa soldier's eye contact, not challenging, not submitting, the eye contact of a man who had entered a space and had no intention of leaving it until the geometry of the situation changed. The soldiers held position. 4 seconds. 7. 10. And then the one on the left moved his weapon slightly off axis. Not a full stand down, a partial adjustment. The kind of adjustment a body makes when something in its instinct chain sends a signal that overrides the surface instruction. The one on the right did the same. They held position, but they had moved, and the move was toward the wall and not toward the center of the corridor where I was standing. I walked forward, steadily, the same pace I had used coming down the maintenance spine, the pace of a man going somewhere because that was where he needed to be. They let us through. I did not understand it, not completely, not in a way I could explain with a document reference or a xenobiology profile. I understood it the way you understand gravity, as a thing that was true, with properties, that you worked with instead of against. We came out in the lower access route and down to Bay 11 and through the blast doors that were still unlocked on this side of the zone. The honor guard was there, 16 soldiers in diamond formation on the bay side of the locked doors, waiting. When they saw her, the formation moved. I stepped back and let it close around her. She was safe. The aides were safe. The station's security response was already moving in the upper hub. I could hear it through the secondary announcement system, which was now reporting that the situation was contained and personnel were being verified by zone. I set my kit bag down. I leaned against the wall. I breathed out once, which was the same breath I had been holding since the junction, which I had not noticed I was holding until it was over. One of the aides said something to her in Veloci. A question. She answered. I did not catch the words. I picked up my kit. The manifest was still open on my tablet. 4.5 kilograms of variants. 17 crates. One had been missing, found, relocated. The cooler under the bunk was probably still there. I had 4 hours until departure. Sarah was looking at me across the bay. I looked back. The honor guard had reformed. Her aides were being attended to. The whole architecture of her protection had reconstituted itself around her, exactly as it was designed to do. She looked at me the way I had looked at the relay junction 2 days ago, like something that needed to be understood, like something she did not yet have the right tool for. I nodded once, turned back toward Bay 11. I had a manifest to close. She found me at the gate with 1 hour to departure. I was the last cargo crew member on the board. Every other vessel had either departed or locked their crew in for pre-departure hold. The departures display above the gate was cycling through rotation numbers and timestamps with the indifferent efficiency of systems that did not care whether you had been in a maintenance corridor an hour ago or sleeping in your cabin the entire posting. She came without the honor guard. 2 aides at a distance that said they were present and ready, and also understanding that this was not that kind of conversation. She was still in the diplomatic robe. I was still in the cargo crew vest, with the toolkit on my hip and the manifest tablet in my left hand. The contrast was, again, doing work. I am told, she said, that the security footage from the maintenance corridor junction is being reviewed by 3 separate analysis teams. That's efficient, I said. The Greth footage from Sublevel 9 has been shared with the Veloci Xenobiology Division. They'll find it interesting. Yes, she paused. They will find it more than interesting. The preliminary analysis uses the word unprecedented, which is a word the Xenobiology Division uses rarely and reluctantly. I checked the departures board. 58 minutes. The Veloci Concordat, she said, is prepared to offer you a formal commendation and a classification. She said the classification. I will not repeat it here because the Veloci naming system for behavioral categories is long, and the specific category she named was the highest non-species designation in their taxonomy. I had read about it. I knew what it meant. It meant above the line, recognized, named, known. I looked at the departures board. I am good, I said. The diplomatic register she had been using to hold the conversation in a formal shape flexed, slightly, like a structure encountering wind. Do you understand what I am offering you? She said. And I turned then, full turn. I looked at her the way I had looked at the Greth in the junction and the Kreth saw soldiers in the corridor, directly, without challenge, without submission, with the patience of someone who has made peace with being an afterthought and found, somewhere along the way, that the peace itself was worth more than the recognition would have been. I know what you are offering, I said, and I know why. You need to put me somewhere in your system. It needs to make sense to you. I moved through 2 situations that your taxonomy does not have a file for, and now you want to create the file. She did not answer. She was listening the way she had listened in the debrief, with the complete, organized attention of someone who understood that what was being said was going to matter and should not be interrupted. The Greth backed away because I gave them no signal they had a file for, I said. The Kreth Sa soldiers let us through for the same reason, not because I was trained, not because I ranked above them, because whatever I am, it did not fit the shape of what they were prepared to respond to. I picked up the kit bag from the floor where I had set it. The moment you name it, I said, you teach every species in your xenobiology division what to look for. You write the file, you give them the signal. I started toward the gate. And the day after you do that, I am just another entry in a database. I was 3 steps from the gate when I stopped. I did not turn around. I spent 23 years being no entry in any database, I said. It turns out that is more useful than it sounds. The gate opened. I walked through it. The departures board cycled. 1 hour became 50 minutes. Bay 11 was processing its pre-departure sequence. Somewhere in the upper hub, 3 analysis teams were reviewing footage and reaching conclusions that would find their way into documents that would be read by people who would write other documents, and eventually the information would make its way to a xenobiology file in the Veloci Concordat's central archive. Princess Sarah of the Veloci Concordat stood at the departures gate. She held in her hand the commendation document she had prepared. It had his name at the top. It had the classification designation in formal Veloci script. It had her seal. She looked at it. She thought about the relay junction in Sublevel 9 and the protein cube grid and the corridor with the 2 soldiers and the way they had moved to the wall without being asked. She thought about what he had said. The day after you do that, I am just another entry in a database. She thought about what she had been about to do, and she thought about what it would have been like to hand a document to something that moved the way weather moved and tell it that she had found a category for it. She folded the document. She did not file it. She stood at the gate for another minute after Bay 11's departure light went green, listening to the sound of a ship that knew exactly where it was going, pull away from the dock with the steady, unhurried certainty of something that had never needed anyone's permission to move. The secondary announcement system was running a routine post-incident report, personnel accounted for, by zone and classification. The list ran through every species, every rank, every diplomatic credential. At the bottom, cargo crew, all vessels, verified and departed. No names, no categories. Just the count. She put the commendation document in the inside pocket of the diplomatic robe. She thought she would probably take it out again someday when she was sitting with her xenobiology files and the cursor was blinking and she was trying to build a category around something that did not have edges. She would unfold it and look at his name and think about the stripped bolt and the butter knife and the way his hand stayed still in every piece of footage she had reviewed. She would put it away again. Some things were worth more unnamed. The departures board cleared Bay 11 from the display. The entry was gone. She turned from the gate and walked back toward the station hub, and the diplomatic robe moved with her, and the two aides fell into step, and the Veloci Concordat's machinery of rank and classification and protocol reorganized itself around her presence the way it always did. She led it. She carried the folded document and the particular silence of something that had passed through without being caught, and she understood, in a way her 14 years of training had not prepared her for, that some forces in the universe were not less powerful for going unclassified. They were more. The transit lane out of Arun was standard, monitored, charted, logged at every beacon. My ship's transponder signal would be on the Concordat's traffic records for the next 6 hours until we hit the outer belt approach and the monitoring grid thinned to the point where it mostly just noted that you had entered and did not fall asleep on the controls. I was in my bunk, 6 minutes after departure, with the manifest tablet on my chest and the final count confirmed. 17 crates, all present, net variance resolved. The cooler under the bunk in cabin 3 was still there. I had verified it on my way to the gate, and I had made a note in the internal crew log. Not a disciplinary note, just a note. A record of a small, private happiness that had survived an emergency lock and a shaped charge and 2 Krethsaw soldiers and had come out the other side exactly where it had been, which was more than could be said for most things. I put the tablet down. I thought about the debrief room and the protein cube grid and a woman who had built a system for understanding everything she encountered and had come, at the end of a 4-day posting, to the gate with a document in her hand and a category ready. I thought about what she was going to do with the empty slot in her taxonomy. I thought she was probably going to be fine. People who understood things well enough to recognize the limit of their understanding were usually fine. The ship moved through the monitoring grid and the beacon intervals stretched out, and the stars through the port window were the same stars they always were, indifferent, permanent, not organized around anyone in particular. I closed my eyes. The manifest was done. 6 hours to the outer belt, plenty of time to sleep.